Welcome, bienvenue. My name is Janice Charette, and I'm the High Commissioner for Canada here in the United Kingdom. It's my honor today to be speaking to you for this first event of an exciting program of talks and other activities to accompany the Citi exhibition, Arctic Culture and Climate. Le Canada est une nation arctique fière. L'Arctique couvre 40% de notre territoire et compte plus de 140 000 autochtones et autres peuples du Nord. Comme vous allez voir dans l'exposition, le Nord est intégral à la structure de l'histoire et la culture canadienne. Par contre, avec l'incertitude du changement climatique, l'Arctique est en train de se changer à un rythme sans précédent. Canada is a proud Arctic nation. The Arctic covers 40% of our landmass, and it is populated by over 140,000 Indigenous persons and other peoples from the North. As you're going to see in this exhibition, the North is an integral part of the history and the culture of Canada. On the other hand, with the uncertainty created by climate change, the Arctic is changing at an unprecedented pace. These changes threaten the well-being of Arctic inhabitants and imperil the fragile Arctic environment. In response, Canada is deepening our engagement with Indigenous peoples and northern communities, providing significant investments in healthcare and food systems, in infrastructure and Arctic culture. We are enhancing our commitment to the Arctic Council and working with our Arctic partners to address pressing issues. We are also intensifying our broader international engagement and expanding cooperation with our partners to improve economic opportunities and to build resilient, sustainable communities. It's a great privilege for me to have the opportunity to introduce to you British Museum Curator for the Americas, Amber Lincoln, as well as one of the world's most recognized environmental and human rights advocates, Sheila Watt-Cloutier. Before joining the museum, Amber's research documented Alaska native reindeer herding histories and legacies for a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. She is focused on the circumpolar North, material heritage, and phenomenology for her PhD in anthropology at the University of Aberdeen. Amber continues to conduct research in the circumpolar North with Indigenous advisors who further her education with their teachings. Sheila Watt-Cloutier is an extraordinary ambassador for the preservation of Inuit culture in the Arctic. She served as Canadian president of the Inuit Circumpolar Council and was later elected to become their international chair, representing approximately 180,000 Inuit of Alaska, Greenland, Canada, and Russia. Sheila is an officer of the Order of Canada and the recipient of the Aboriginal Achievement Award. She is the UN Champion of the Earth Award and the Jack P. Blaney Award for Dialogue, as well as the Norwegian Sophie Prize and the Right Livelihood Award. Her best-selling book, The Right to Be Cold, explores the parallels between safeguarding the Arctic and the survival of Inuit culture. It is now my very great pleasure to hand over to Amber Lincoln.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Charette, for this warm introduction and information about Canada's role and activities in the North. And thank you all in the audience for joining us. Of course, we would love to see you up in person, but given that we can't, this is a great alternative. And I guess one thing it does do is enable participation from all over the world. So that's wonderful. Sheila and I are going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to questions to the audience. So get your questions ready, and please do give us your name and where you're watching from. It would be a lot of fun for us to just know where people are. So I'm thrilled to have this opportunity to speak with Sheila Watt-Cloutier, or Sheila, as she is called in Inuktitut, the Inuit language. Sheila is a woman whose work over the years I have admired greatly. And we at the British Museum are particularly grateful to have her join us and talk today. So Sheila, thank you and welcome. I know we've caught you at your home in your from your hometown in Umiaq, Nunavik. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Great. So as part of the programming around the Citi exhibition, Arctic Culture and Climate, which opens today, actually, very exciting, and runs through February, the British Museum has planned a series of discussions and panels with various experts and leaders about climate change, climate justice, the connections between capitalism and climate change, Indigenous rights. And it's no coincidence that Sheila is here, talking to us about her book, The Right to be Cold. And it's really no coincidence that she's kicking off this series. Our exhibition has definitely been informed and inspired by Sheila's work. The exhibition is about Indigenous perspectives on Arctic histories and environments, and it addresses the timely issue of climate change. And it focuses, it's attempting to present this human face of climate change in the Arctic. So Sheila has worked, for many years in Nunavik school systems. She has worked for her corporation, Makivik Corporation, and she has, for years has had involvement with the Inuit Circumpolar Council as both president and chair between the years of 1995 and 2006. And she's really best known for reframing the climate change discussions, arguing that climate change is in fact a human rights issue. And in so doing, she's really made the world pay attention to the threats to Inuit and their way of life as a result of climate change. Sheila has reflected on these in her book here. I'm pulling it out, and I encourage anybody to read it. It's quite powerful because I guess, Sheila, one of the things that I find just so wonderful about it is that you eloquently sort of talk about the history of Inuit and colonialism and the difficulties that people face, the challenges that they've overcome, and those connections to climate change while you are tracing your own life history. So it really personalizes this story and helps, it helps us, I think it helps the reader sort of understand it better. I thought maybe we would just start from there. Maybe you could start us and share with us a little bit about your early life, where you grew up, how you grew up, and that, maybe I'll hand it over to you then.
Sure, thank you. And thank you to the museum for having me here today. It's lovely to be in front of you. I'm delighted to be here with all those who are listening in. I'm pleased to be sharing this story with you today in terms of the work that I have been doing, but the life that I have lived as an Inuit woman, and humanizing the issue of climate change in the past 25 years has been my focus on trying to get Inuit on the map differently from what history has depicted us, ironically enough, in museums and so on with that history, but also as victims to globalization. We are a powerful, wonderful, resilient creative, innovative people who have much to offer in terms of our understanding with nature and with the landscape and the harsh environment that we live in. So we know quite a bit about sustainability, but yet very few people know about that strength that we have as Inuit living in the Arctic. And so humanizing the issue of climate change has been a daunting task, there's no doubt. But at the same time now, I think with all that's happening in terms of others around the world being impacted by climate change and realizing it impacts them as well, is starting to pick up. So this is a timely space and place in time to be sharing, again, the human face to these issues. We are people, I grew up traveling only by dog team the first 10 years of my life. And today, we're in a fast-paced world. Up until March, when everything came to a halt, I was traveling by air all over the world, in terms of telling this story and trying to get people to take action, that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic, that it is impacting negatively everyone else all over the world. The ice is the air conditioner, if you will, the cooling system for the planet. So as that starts to break down, of course, we start to see the evidence of what the negative impacts that it's having. So the ice is the life force of Inuit. It has been for millennia. That ice represents transportation and mobility for us. And because that is our highways that brings us out to the environment for our food, our country food that is so important to us for our health on so many levels. And it is a way in which we also teach and train our children on that ice and that cold, the character building skills. And I'll get into that in a few minutes. So that ice has a lot of importance to us in our lives as Inuit of the Arctic. And as that starts to go, then it becomes an issue of safety and security first and foremost, because then, with the conditions that are difficult now more to read by our hunters, it becomes precarious and where there's danger involved in all of that. So the changes that are happening as well are really stark up here in the Arctic in terms of our environment, and that the changes that are happening with the ice, the snow, the coastal erosion that's happening, creating a lot of erosion happening particularly in Alaska and the Beaufort Sea area in the western part of Canada. The permafrost that is melting, that's creating buckling of homes, where some of our homes are having to be relocated to different places where it's more solid. We have invasive species now of insects, birds, fish that sometimes we don't know the names for because they are new to the region. The weather patterns have changed so tremendously that even traditional knowledge that we have relied upon can be very difficult now to pass on to the younger generation, because our elders now say there's a disclaimer every time there are those changes. And say, this is what we've been taught for millennia. This is how usually you will read the conditions of the weather, the clouds, the ice. However, they say with the disclaimer of because of climate change, it's become more difficult. So you need to be more vigilant in being safe out there as you are in pursuit of the wonderful country food that you need to bring home to our families and to our communities. So that's basically, where we're coming from in terms of the ice, the importance of it, and the lessons that are taught on that snow and ice.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I wonder if you can, maybe draw the comparison to sort of as you were growing up. I know you sort of touched on this a little bit, but I know you've said before, we've been from ice age to space age, and so if you can talk a little bit about the lessons and the teachings that you had as a young child and that many other kids had.
Yes, absolutely. And again, as I say, it's not just about the pursuit of the animals that we harvest to eat, but even that in of itself is extremely important to us. And I'll start with that perhaps, and then I'll get into the character building that is so important for us, that we are taught as children out there in nature and in the environment. But the country foods that we do go and harvest are extremely important in terms of the nutritional value that it gives for us in the Arctic, where, you know, most people don't understand or know that when you're out there in 50 below zero hunting for hours upon hours in a day, that you need to have food that keeps you warm. And I can guarantee you that when you eat seal meat, that it keeps you very, very warm in those cold conditions, because it warms you from the inside out. So there's a real strong nutritional value to all the minerals and vitamins and omega-3s that come with the marine mammals that we hunt and that we eat. The cultural value, again, and I'll get into that now, is really important in terms of the character building skills. It isn't just about the actual technical aspect of learning how to assess the situation and how to be out there patiently waiting for the animals to surface and the winds to die, and all of those things that are really important to read, those conditions. So you put everything on your side to be able to be that proficient provider and hunter that brings home the food. But you're also learning how to be a natural conservationist when you're out there. In the traditional ways in which we teach our children through observation. But it's also very much when you're out there, as you are waiting for the animals to surface and the snow to fall, the ice to form, you're also learning about yourself. You're being taught patience. You're being taught how to be courageous and bold under pressure. You're being taught how to take the right survival-based risks. You're being taught how not to be impulsive. You're being taught how to develop your sound judgment and your strong wisdom that you need, not just to survive and be an efficient provider, but also those kinds of skills that you're learning about yourself are very transferable to the modern world. And so the modern world, in the setting that we've coming from, in the speed in which things have happened, is really important for our younger generation to have and learn those kinds of lessons, so that when they, in times of great stressors in the modern setting and dealing with the historical traumas that we've come through, they're able and apt to have that built-in capability to withstand stressful situations. As you may know, we have the highest rates of suicide in North America due to the historical traumas, due to the rapid changes, the tumultuous changes, due to coming out of this kind of holistic teaching that we do for our children to institutional schooling that separates all of these issues and then doesn't put them back together. And so you're really not teaching the character skills and the resiliency and the coping skills of our children to be able to deal with stressful situations that have arisen due to the colonialistic approaches that have been done to us. And so that's the importance of it. So it isn't just about polar bears and ice. This is about our children and the way in which we are trying to prepare and maintain a remarkable way in which we teach our children for the opportunities and the challenges of life. And so that's the importance of that, the cultural value of that. The emotional value, again, is about identity and the grounding that we get and the euphoria that we have when we eat from the same animal. There's nothing more powerful than that in terms of the ceremony around all of that, and the connection to family and the connection to the hunter himself and our ancestry. The spiritual value is extremely important when you're out there hunting and our men are in a yogic position for many, many hours waiting for that seal to surface. That's meditation in motion, in that space of stillness that you're with yourself and in those moments, the powerful moments that happen out there in nature. And so for me, I always use the connection of, you know, you're in the South, you're gardening, your hands are dirty in your soil, you know, as you're gardening, and you're connected to source in those moments where you are just yourself dealing with your food source that you're growing. For us, like that, it's like that with blood on the ice. Our hands are in the blood as we're hunting. This is the source that we connect to. This is our bounty. This is our garden, the same as yours in your soil as your hands are getting dirty. And for us, it's the same thing. And people don't really fully embrace that, because they get very squeamish when they see, oh, blood in the ice. It's like, oh dear, what is that? But it's not. For us, it is not a confirmation of death when you see blood on the ice. It's affirmation of life. It is life-giving life. That's who we are as Inuit. And the communal eating is, again, it's that ceremony of bringing the bond and the people together. And the medicinal value of our food is also never to be undervalued, because it is powerful. It is what keeps us warm. It is what keeps us healthy, with all of the vitamins and the minerals and the iron and the omega-3. So all of those are what we are all about in terms of our food, in terms of our hunting, and the connections to nature and the respect for it that we have for our environment all around us.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really wonderful. And I think if anybody has, spent time in Inuit communities, you really get that sense of, people coming together and, sort of the camaraderie around country food and the importance of that. And when I was working with seamstresses in Metimatalik, and people were stressing. One woman said, my blood gets low when I don't eat seal meat, and another woman said, I forget all of my Inuktitut. So here we have language, we have health, and then you have the whole community sharing, and the generosity of animals and the generosity of hunters. And I think it's very clear when you do spend time in those communities. I wanted to
Absolutely.
Sorry to interrupt. I wanted to pick up on one thing. I'm not sure all of our listeners really know that sort of some of that colonial history and the impact on Inuit, and maybe we can go through that a little bit. And I can certainly start by talking about the role of museums. You mentioned it at the beginning, and Inuit and other indigenous peoples across the Arctic and frankly elsewhere as well have had difficult relations with museums, and part of that was people taking important cultural heritage away and not providing access to that. And so maybe we can carry on talking about this and other elements of the sort of really significant results and the traumatic results that people still live with today as a result of fur trade, colonialism, all of the relocation. Would that be okay?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's fine. Absolutely. And that's right. Very few people know about this history in terms of the what we call now the historical traumas that have happened in our world, where our sense of identity, our sense of self-worth, all of those things were stripped away as a result of those historical traumas. And because what led way to all of that was the addictions, the violence, the suicides that are happening and still reign in our communities as a result of that history. And so, in the 20s, when we were made to become fur traders to support the global markets for fur, we became very involved, engaged in the global world way back then. And that's in the 1920s or so, that was happening. And then, of course, you had the collapse of the fur market, and then we went into a starvation where very few people even paid any attention to what was happening in the Arctic once the market fell. And then we were forced into communities in the 1950s, you know, and I was one of those. We were living across the river in Old Fort Chimo, where I was 4 years old when we moved across to where we are living today. And we were forced into community living rather than living out on the land. And so things started to happen very quickly. Our diets were changing, our way of life was changing, our housing was changing, all of those things. And so the poor choices started to come in. And that was the beginning, really, of the breakdown of Inuit society in those days. And then, of course, the historical traumas, the forced relocations into the high Arctic, where many families from southern parts of, or not southern parts, but more south of Nunavut, for example, in Nunavik, like Inuit and other places, were forced into the high Arctic in the name of sovereignty. And we had the dog slaughters, which very few people know about. I chronicle a lot of that in my book to allow people to understand that there is a real historical trauma history in all of this. And there is a root of these problems that we face in our communities. The sexual abuse by authorities, the seal bans, you know, that were created by emotionally driven, misguided animal rights movements that took away what we considered to be very sustainable for our communities, where the byproduct of our subsistence hunt was sold, the pelts were sold, and many families were able to make it through in those transitioning years. And that was taken away. And so all of these things started to happen in terms of the addictions, you know, and the violence that started to happen. The land claims, you know, there's good and there's bad. We were able to take on some of our own institutions, but nonetheless, it also took away a lot of relinquishment of our rights. And so we still deal with that and trying to implement these land rights, which are not always an easy task for our leaders to do with our own governments. Then we had the toxins issue in the 80s. Which I was very heavily engaged in negotiating with the UN on these toxins that ended up in our food chain. So here we were coming out the other side of trying to understand what has happened in our world, and the very thing that we've been reaching to now, which is our culture, our food, our way of life for the answers and solutions, we were then being poisoned from afar. Where our country food was laden with all these cocktails of toxins from pesticides and byproducts of industry from very far away into our food chain. And the nursing milk of our mothers had to think twice about nursing their babies as a result of that. It wasn't just a chemical story, but it was a health issue first and foremost. And that was the work that I did with the UN on helping to negotiate, along with the Dene and the Gwich'in and the Métis, and we worked very closely together with the Canadian government as well. That was one of those situations where the Canadian government and Indigenous people sang from the same song sheet, and we modeled for the world what could be done in partnership to address urgent matters of the Arctic. And that's one of the proud moments for me, was to have led that, the voices of the Arctic peoples on that very challenging issue of food toxins in our food. And the unchecked climate change issues now that are adding to all of what's happening now. These are huge issues for a small number of people to face in a short period of time, where we are now grappling with all of these issues. And climate change, of course, is yet another assault on a very vulnerable situation in our world. And so we have to humanize this issue. It isn't just about science, economics, politics. This is about the human communities of the Arctic that are so negatively impacted, and how we have to continue to signal to the world that it matters what happens in the Arctic as it impacts everywhere else, as I said earlier. So indeed, we have to continue not only to humanize it, but make it a human rights issue. And that's the work that I did in 2005 when I launched that legal petition to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, because our right to health, our right to our homes, our right to our culture, our right to education, all of those rights that are already entrenched in international law were then being minimized. and being limited as a result of the climatic changes that were happening. And so that connection that I led and pioneered at the time was ahead of its time in a sense. And so you know, many people didn't even get it in terms of what does that mean? Climate change is a human rights violation of the Inuit of the Arctic. Nobody quite got that, including some very versed people on human rights issues, because most people, of course, were understanding human rights violations as, torture and violation of individual rights. But never did they think in terms of collective rights that could be violated in that way. And so pioneering that work was very daunting as well. But we had that positive reinforcement of how successful we were with the Persistent Organic Pollutants Treaty, the Stockholm Treaty. So with that experience, we were able to push forward. And although it was not heard completely by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in Washington, D.C., they did hear the legal impacts, and they wanted to hear that. So I think it helped to change the world in terms of the discourse of the language of climate change, one of technical and politics to human and human rights. And since then, of course, everybody's on board. It only took a few years for it to become mainstream language. And so I'm again proud of that we were able to, from the Arctic, influence the world on addressing this climate change as a human rights issue. Yeah.
Absolutely, and yeah, you were a pioneer in that, and maybe a few years ahead of your time. But certainly, young Alaska Natives and young Indigenous people throughout the world are stepping up. For instance, there's a legal battle right now in Alaska in which young Alaska Natives are suing the state for these exact collective rights being infringed upon. So, yes, you must be a bit proud. you should be, I guess. But one thing I really want to get across, and you've made this point so well, is this connection between the sort of historical human trauma and planet trauma. And I wonder if you could sort of expand upon that and talk a little bit about these connections.
Yes, of course. Well, our planet is a living, breathing entity, and we often don't see it as such. It has been for thousands of years been so exploited that we have forgotten that it is a living, breathing entity and not just a place where resources are to be exploited and ruined, really, at so many levels. Its atmosphere, the land, the water, the seas, all of that. It's not just about the riches that lie there that need to be dug up and used for purposes of modern technology and so on, but it's a wonderful, beautiful place that we live on this earth. And so for me, the connection is very clear, and I think it's very clear for many Indigenous people around the world as well, who have always tried to protect what they love. And it's to try to get the world to understand that we need to fall back in love with nature and with the earth to be able to protect it. And that's what I often say now in all of the talks that I give: fall back in love with nature and you will be compelled to protect it. And so that's how I think Indigenous peoples live, by that kind of law, the law of loving nature, to be able to protect it and to keep it giving to us, in the bounty of its land and seas and all of that. So for me, the unsustainable ways in which the world has worked has certainly force the planet to react in the very, how can you say, the violent storms and all of the things that are happening today and other erratic events, as a result of what we have been doing to it. And so this is really not unlike the child or even an adult or women who have gone through trauma, but have never had the ability to be able to heal from those traumas, and never been given the coping mechanisms to be able to cope with those traumas and move forward and become healthy again, and have any kind of effective mechanisms or to help them. It becomes inevitable that there's going to be behavioral problems developing as a result of those unchecked traumas that have happened to children, to women, to anyone who has not gone and gotten the help to deal with those traumas. And so the erratic behavior starts to happen. And of course, that's what we see in our communities, are the self-destructive patterns, the addictions, the violence, all of that is connected to the unchecked trauma that has happened. So too our earth, that has been so traumatized in so many ways, with pollution, with industry, with the way in which we have done things unsustainably. Of course, our planet, being a living, breathing entity, is going to act out in erratic ways. The hurricanes, the droughts, the fires, all of those things are very much a consequence of what we have been doing to our earth. And so that's the connection that I see between human trauma and planet trauma. And so what we see in our communities is in our atmosphere are not abnormal behaviors. They are, in fact, what we're seeing are perfectly normal reactions to very abnormal, extreme abnormal circumstances. So do you see what I mean by in terms of that connection? So if we can see it that way, because in all of the talks that I've given over the years, when I say we are the land and the land is us, there is no separation between our planet and ourselves. And so if we can treat it with respect and fairness and kindness, then we will be halfway there in terms of being able to change the course of what's happening with climate change and the destruction that is happening there.
Yeah. And I think, that just rings, it just makes all kinds of sense. And I think that what you also said, or what sort of struck me so much from your talks and reading your books is that that rapid change that Inuit went through, that led to so much, the families being separated, people not learning their language or not learning the skills that gave them the character and the resilient coping mechanisms, that led to the abusive behaviors, right? The sort of addiction, perhaps, and then you've said that, but Inuit turned back toward these traditional heritage, traditional cultural activities as a way to deal with this, to build capacity in people, to build this resilience, and then all of a sudden, those activities were hunting on the land, traveling on the land, using those taken materials to sew, to make tools, and yet at the same time that people have tried to use that to build capacity, that land, those animals, that way of life is threatened, and I think that's just so chilling. In so many ways, and really makes, your point is so well made. I'm going to pass that. I'm sorry. I can ask another question, but I just wanted to sort of lay that out and explain. But
yes, but you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I mean, that's what I meant by, here we were trying to piece together, why have we, as such a highly independent people who have lived so sustainably for so long, teaching our children for the opportunities and challenges of life, and so interdependent with nature and learning so naturally how to survive, and not just survive, but thrive in this harsh environment. How did we come from that place to be now so dependent on processes, institutions, substances, almost overnight? How did this happen? And so we started to learn about this history and how impacted, because there was silence for many years. For example, the dog slaughter, nobody spoke about it for 20, 30 years. It was such a horrific situation. So our men buried it deeply inside of them and never spoke about it. And so, all of these traumas really at the source of all of that, we started to understand these pieces, and we started to develop programs, and we still are, that would address the historical traumas. But one thing that we have learned through this process of looking at our education system to see whether or not it's working for our youth, looking at programs, looking at our governance systems, all of these things, and the questions that we ask, is that the historical trauma is a very big piece of it, but the solutions lie right in front of us, and it's with our culture, our language, our culture, the way in which we respect all things around us, the way in which we teach our children, as I said earlier, the character building that institutional schooling just can't do in a classroom setting. All of those answers are right here. And here we are getting to that place, and we are turning the curve there on that and better understanding. And here comes climatic changes so big that they are threatening the very thing that we're turning to for the solutions for our children. And so that's the irony of all of this. And so climatic changes, as I say, and the changes that are happening here very rapidly, is much more than just ice and polar bears that the outside world seems to focus on. It's about our children, our communities, and it's about that, to keep them alive, to keep built in that resiliency and the built-in capability to say no to self-destructive patterns, to say no to suicides, to build and embrace their lives and honor the remarkable history we come from. That's one of the big reasons why I wrote the book, was to not just to share with the world who we are about, but also for our younger generation who carry the brunt of these historical traumas on their shoulders without really knowing the historical context of it. I wanted them to better understand that, so that they can I can help at least a little bit lessen the load of that burden they carry without fully understanding why their families and their communities are struggling and why it's so dark. And inside our emotions and inside our spirit. So it's really about building back the spirit of our younger generation and the pride back with our hunters and our culture, to say, this is who we are. We are more than the trauma that we have gone through. Yeah. We are a people who can offer even to the world the lessons of sustainability and what it takes. And that's why I say often now is that the indigenous wisdom that has been so oppressed and so suppressed for so long has to surface in a strong way, because it is the medicine the world seeks. The indigenous wisdom is the medicine the world seeks to deal with issues of our planet, to live sustainably and to live with respect of our planet. That's the crux of the message that I have been wanting to give.
So you've kind of answered it. I've got a number of questions already lining up here, but let's just carry on for just a little bit more. You've kind of touched on this already, but what does the world need? What do we need to get rid of?
Yes, I understand. Yes, and I'll tell a little quick story about the time that I was in Australia or New Zealand for book festivals a few years back. I was one of the the 3 or 4 Canadians that were chosen to go down to book festivals. And I was on a panel with Tim Flannery, and many of you perhaps know Tim Flannery, who is one of the I think, the world's best climatologists. And he was on a panel. We were a panel together. At the end of this panel, and there's a large audience there in New Zealand, he's Australian, and an audience member asked him, so what is it about us in the world that is lacking, that is not allowing us to act as urgent as we need to address climate change? What is lacking in us when we know the science is there, you know, and it's collaborated, of course, and these are my words, collaborated by Indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge that knows what's happening on the ground. In fact, the Indigenous peoples of the world are the ground truthers of this science. You know, as using an astronomer word. So we ground truth what scientists and researchers say, the Western world. We, you know, if we know that it's truth, we are the ground truthers because we live with it every day. And so his answer when he was asked this, what is lacking in us? He said, imagination. And I thought, wow, imagination, imagining that we could do this differently. Imagining that we can create different ways of doing business, imagining that we can create different programs that are more sustainable, policies that are more sustainable and respectful. We can create new programs at every single level, and our activities that are so unsustainable now can be shifted if we can imagine it to be a different world in how we do things. And so that has stayed with me all this time. And I use that a lot because I realized, and as I put that a little bit even further in terms of my thinking and perspective on imagination, I say, absolutely. We need to reimagine and realign economic values with those of the Indigenous world. And that is about living sustainably without having to use everything up and destroy our world. We don't need to do that anymore. We can live fully with just using what we need. And that's the thing. We don't waste what we don't use. If you've been in the Arctic, so you know, we use every part of the animal. If we don't eat it, we use it for other purposes, for clothing, for tools, you name it. And so, you know, it's to be able to respect everything that we use from the land and the animals. And so it's the values that are based on fairness, on respect for our planet, for our land, for each other, is an important piece for us to look at. So I say imagination. So let's imagine differently from what we have been imagining. We haven't even imagined. We have just worked with our heads without really thinking about the heartfelt way in which where we need to have spirited leadership from those positions that is leading the way. And the younger generation, I must say, give me the hope because they are there. They see this, they understand this, and they really want to do something differently. They're not mired in the politics, so they are very, very keen to do things differently. And I have hope that this younger generation is going to lead from a very soulful, respectful place for our earth, because this is their future. And they're the ones who have really given me a lot of hope. So anyway, so there's a couple of things I think we wanted to go through, and that one is the pandemic connection and the leadership. So let's, shall we get into that before we,
I know we've gone on. Yes, I'm gonna leave it to you. We do have a number of questions coming in, and we've got we're at about almost 50 minutes. So why don't you? I know that we have talked about COVID. Why don't you talk us through some of your thinking on this and the connections you've come up with between COVID and climate change and.
Yeah, well, you know, we've been in lockdown up here in the Arctic for, you know, quite a few months now, since March. And the fact that we're far from the cities has been our saving grace in a sense. So we have very few COVID, cases. And we're grateful for that. But we brace ourselves just in case, and everybody's very prepared because we have been through pandemics before as Indigenous peoples, and many people have been wiped out as a result of that history. And so we know what can happen. And because our health systems already are not the best up here in the Arctic, then it becomes a case of any given time things can escalate very quickly. But it has given me a lot of thought in terms of thinking about things differently, even with the work that I do, and at first, of course, it's shocking. Like everybody else went in shock, I think, the first 1 or 2 months in isolation, and how our lives just came to a halt. Everything came to a halt very suddenly, and so. What it has given me the understanding that even more so the Arctic is very connected and interrelated and interconnected to the larger global world. Once again, we see that is very much a connection that we have. But what has happened more so, on my reflections on that, is that the pandemic has broken open even more so the weakened systems that exist around the world, and particularly to the most vulnerable. And so you saw, the Black lives and the Navajo in the United States and other Indigenous peoples being so negatively impacted, and again being very hit hard by COVID as a result of the already weakened, weak health systems and the actual policies that are very structural racism. Are still reigning in many of those. And so the social injustices and the health systems that are not good and not working well already have really made the communities even more vulnerable in terms of COVID. And so the pandemic also has, of course, given us a pause to think about a lot of these things, in terms of how people just want to focus perhaps on, it's those bats or it's the Chinese. But in reality, we have to think much deeper than that and wonder why things have happened the way they have. And we know that, it is the habitat of wildlife and the climatic changes that are happening around the world that are very much connected to and at the root of what is happening with these new viruses that are emerging. And they're only going to emerge even more if we don't address these issues of our environmental degradation of the habitat of many wildlife around the world, including the bats. And so to make those kinds of connections is important for people to understand that it isn't just about trying to other one another once again, by blaming certain people, by blaming certain animals for what has happened, but for the larger picture of what it is that we have done to our planet to cause these kinds of viruses to emerge in this way. And I hope it will be a time because where people will start to see that connection even stronger, because there was near the end of my work, I've been doing this for 25 years now. And I have often asked the question, I wonder what it will take for the world to see this as an urgent matter. I wonder what will happen that will be a huge monumental issue that will challenge us. But I never in my wildest dreams would have thought it would be a virus that would have brought everything to a halt. I just never would have imagined that. But it has been that, I think, that has allowed people to make the connections, because almost overnight, the air, the sea, the rivers, the lakes around the cities cleared. So you can see that once you lower the unsustainable activities around the world, the planes, the cars, everything, that things can clear rather quickly. The air cleared in many of the big cities. Animals surfaced where they haven't surfaced in the past. So you know that if we did the right thing, that there would be a better way in which our atmosphere can heal. Now, it's not to suggest that it's going to happen, because we don't know if we're just going to go back to our old ways. Are we going to just do half measures that aren't going to be effective once again? And so those kinds of connections continue to help me keep those kinds of connections open so that we can address the issue for what it really is. And it's, once again, human trauma, planet trauma are one of the same. And this is what's happened with this virus. So that's the kind of connection that I have been making and seeing and doing a bit of writing about in terms of that connection between the pandemic and climate change.
Well, thank you for that. And we promised that we would open this up to audience questions, and we have some really great ones coming in. So I am going to do this. This is from Georgina Colburn from Inverness, Scotland. And she writes, "The knowledge, strength, and resilience of Indigenous communities are the key to human survival and sustainability in the 21st century and beyond. Is there a global forum to bring governments together with Indigenous leaders from the Arctic and elsewhere to humanize the climate emergency and address the ongoing threat to all life on Earth?"
Yes, well, we certainly have, and I think you heard the opening yesterday by Daly Sambodoro, who is the ICC chair, the current chair. I'm a former chair in the past, but she is the current chair, who clearly outlined all of the ways in which ICC is involved and engaged, and continues to be very diligently and very well under her leadership as well. And so there is a forum. There are many forums. In fact, Inuit are involved in all of these things and all of these global processes, and the UN institution of the UN and others, and Arctic Council, and so on. So we are engaged in those areas. But I know from my own experiences, and particularly with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, these are huge venues, you know, that are 10, 15, 20,000 people, delegates who come. And because it is that particular forum is not the same as when we were negotiating the POPs Treaty, where ACC was able to go in and intervene right there along with the delegates. And we were able to work with our Canadian government in those days. The UNFCCC is not the same kind of forum that allows for the intervention of Indigenous voices on the floor, unless you're head of the state of a country that is able to do that. And so what happens is that many of our own delegations go over there, and we're put in we organize side events outside of the plenary. But the plenary is the place that Indigenous voices and leaders need to be in order to be able to contribute even to the language of the text of this climate change document. Because oftentimes, you know, these are cumbersome, tedious, slow moving processes. One year you made a few steps forward in terms of, for example, adding the human rights language into the actual text of it. The following year, you find out it was removed, and then you have to go back and keep fighting. So these are really, you know, it's just really long, tedious ways in which we try to instill change into these documents. So it's not to say that perhaps it will come to be, but there needs to be more in terms, and she's absolutely right. I forgot the name, but who was asking
Georgina,
the question? Hi, Georgina. Thank you for your great question. and lucky you in Scotland. One day I'll go to my roots to visit. And then it just was, so we need to find different ways in which or even stronger ways in which we can elevate those voices now in light of these kinds of crises we're all in together, rather than othering one another and rather than this one up, one down relationships in all of these areas, is to be able to be there on equal footing. And, you know, what would be helpful for everyone, if you get that, and you do obviously, because you've asked the question, keep that momentum going in your own circles, in your own country, everywhere you go, because it isn't just about us teaching the world about who we are and what needs to happen. It's about those who get it to be able to teach each other in your own country, in your own people, with your own people. And so that's an important piece also for me to convey to you. So thank you, though, for your question. Very important one.
And sort of along similar lines, I'm sort of pulling some questions together, but Emily Virginia, who's has asked, I always find it helpful to consult with people outside of my bubble with similar experiences who have made other solutions and other perspectives. Is there such a network in place for the Indigenous people of North America and those in other places of the world, such as South America, Greenland, etc.? I mean, you've mentioned the UN and of course the Inuit Circumpolar Council.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed, Emily, there is, and we have been, you know, since ICC was created by a wonderful Alaskan Inuk, Eben Hobson, back in 1976. We have been working together with fellow Indigenous peoples, the Sami of the four northern Scandinavian countries, and of course in Canada, we're Inuit who come not just from Canada, but Greenland, Alaska, and Russia. And so ICC is that the umbrella, the organization that the NGO actually that deals with the rights and interests of Inuit of the world, of the Arctic. But we do, and we connect through those various forums, you know, whether it's in New York City at the UN Declaration on Indigenous Rights, sessions that go on there every single year, and many other forums. Again, you know, these are long-standing issues that we have to deal with. So many countries in the world that has to come together to accept these declarations as solid declarations that need to move forward and be, you know, applied and to. But yet we have various countries that aren't signing on, you know, or that don't, or just see it as an aspirational document and not a real document, or others that are afraid because of their sovereignty issues that they're not going to sign on. There's all kinds of reasons and excuses that countries don't sign on to these kinds of declarations that would indeed give us more strength and focus to be able to move forward on the rights of Indigenous peoples. But indeed we do. We do attempt, and we do go, many Inuit leaders do go, and ICC certainly is one of them that is involved all the time in bringing in other experiences and working together. We work the closest with the Sami. Inuit and Sami have worked very closely together for many decades now, but we do, of course, work with many others, Indigenous peoples around the world as well. And yet, we are still there where it's not fully, you know, we're not fully engaged because of the governance issues, the governance ways in which countries are dealing with their own Indigenous people.
And I'm reminded too of something you talk about in your book as well, as the Inuit Circumpolar Council has certainly worked with other Indigenous groups in capacity building, right? I know in Ecuador and in Brazil to elevate voices and to work for common ground. So that was important work as well by the ICC.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's right. Because, you know, we've had Inuit, as much as we struggle, we've had a lot of experiences with the land claim negotiations and running of certain businesses and so on. So we have been able to share these kinds of experiences with other Indigenous peoples of the world as well, who are starting from the ground, you know?
Yeah. So we've got a few questions about mining in Greenland. So B. Jan, I'm sorry, I'm probably butchering some of these names, but asks, how do you see the mining in Greenland supported by some of the younger Indigenous people as their possibility for a new future? And Zane Cooper asks, I am researching anti-mining activism in Greenland. And in Greenland, there is a heated debate revolving around increasing oil and mineral extraction supported by the ruling Sismut party over what a potential sovereign Indigenous nation should look like. Could you speak about how debates over resource politics in Greenland are possibly affecting other Indigenous communities in the greater Arctic? It's kind of a tough question.
Oh, it's not only a tough question, but it's a question that I can't answer. I won't answer specifically about Greenland and its mining policies. I'm not at the liberty to do so, and I'm not. I mean, somebody else would be able to answer that definitely from Greenland, or perhaps even ICC Greenland would be a good one to try to get a hold of and see how they respond to that. The thing that I have, but what I can answer is generally, and this is from my perspective. This is not an institutional response because, as you all know, or you may not know, I have been an independent since 2005, leaving elected politics back then, in order to be a kind of a free-spirited writer and speaker on issues that I felt are important for me to convey. And so for me, it's really about the mining issues are more about, for me, from my perspective and where I stand on it, are about it being almost the only carrot that's being dangled in front of us in terms of economic development. And for me, that is something that we need to really stand firmly on and really understand more fully that why would we as Inuit of the Arctic, who are most negatively impacted by the unsustainable activities of the world, then turn to that kind of activity to develop our countries, our regions, when in fact it is the emissions of these unsustainable activities that is creating the warming and the climate changes that are impacting negatively our way of life. For me, it's about standing on moral ground. For me, it might be, but I understand fully and I respect fully that because people are in poor economic states in the North, where there's poverty, housing shortages, health challenges, all of these issues that I speak about are very dire for many. No jobs, no incomes, the high cost of food, 2 to 3 times higher than anywhere else in the world, in the Arctic. And everything is flown in, so that's very expensive to live. Housing shortages allows for 15, 20 people to live in one little home at times. People who are living in shacks by the beach in Nunavut areas. All of these things, I understand those because I live in the community. I know what that is. But at the same time, I think it's really important to be exploring different ways in which we can bring in economy and alleviate the poverty and the health challenges that we face in our communities without having to bow to the only carrot that seems to be dangling in front of us. I understand the need for Greenland to be sovereign from Denmark, and I respect that fully, but I won't speak to the choices that they're making around that. But at the same time, we have to think, in terms of what I have been moving towards in my talks that I give is why couldn't we be addressing this issue more from conservation economies, such as what has happened with the Baffin Island under the leadership of PJ Acheroka, who is the president of QIA, who negotiated with the federal government on protecting a certain area of water and land, and by hiring the hunters to be able to be the guardians of all of that area, protected area, and where, they are natural conservationists to begin with, as I've always said, as Inuit, and it would be protecting all of that, and they would be paid to be who they are, and that is conservation, natural conservationists as Inuit. And that is the conservation economies is a wonderful way in which to create economies in the North and give good jobs. And they're a culture match. You know what I mean? Culture match to me, and I've always used this word for many, many years now, is that it's something that is in alignment with your own ethics, your own principles and values as an Inuk, and you're able to still provide for your family. And so by protecting the land and the rather than exploiting it, why not protect it and be paid for it? So you can look at more if those younger people are asking this question. Look more and Google conservation economies, Baffin Island, and that negotiations that happened recently with the federal government here in Canada. And you will see that there's such potential to that kind of culture match conservation economy way in which we can deal with issues. But, you know, like even the sealing industry, why, you know, because of this misguided way in which animal rights movements took all that away, we can still use a byproduct of our food, subsistence hunting, to be able to make good money. And because we have now these remarkable young generation of designers that are making beautiful products from the byproduct of our hunting sealing, you know, whether it's parkas, whether it's headbands, whether it's mitts, and they're very fashionable, they're very beautiful, and there's a market for that. So why not tap into those kinds of cottage industries rather than these large, you know, that buy into the global markets that are now being questioned as unsustainable. My worry about all of that is that as the world is moving out of those unsustainable activities, we would then be, you know, holding the pieces of the mess that's left behind by these unsustainable development activities in 20, 30 years from now, just like we've been trying to deal with cleaning up after the military from the 40s. We're still cleaning up. So, you know, there's a lot here to think about in these kinds of issues. So I'm sorry, I'm not going to, you know, respond directly to your questions.
No,
about Greenland,
I think that's fine. I think you've given a wonderful response. Absolutely. And I can't help but jump in here on one question, but I completely give you all authority to dodge this question if you want. But I mean, I think, you know, we're all grappling with the idea of you know, of extractive industries and certainly funding of extractive industries. And so we, you know, the British Museum has been criticized for taking sponsorship money from British Petroleum, and in fact, you know, even the exhibit that I'm working on, you know, which is, you know, of course, it's talking about Indigenous people in the Arctic and climate change. You know, we have been criticized for taking Citi sponsorship. Do you have thoughts on that? That you kind of share? Please feel free to, you know, if you don't want to answer, that's fine.
I think for me it's case by case. You know, it really depends on what it is, who it is. That you're taking money from to do this kind of work. It's case by case. In some cases, I often say, well, it's payback time. You know, if you have taken from communities and you have done, you know, destructive ways in which, you know, to tend to your business, it's time to pay back. It's time for people to benefit in some form or another. It's not about losing your sense of morality through it, but it does depend on each case. Every case can be different. You know, you can't have the same kind of scenario acceptance of taking money from certain things in a blanket way. You've got to look at each case quite strategically as well. For some, it's helpful. Other times it's not. It's like the issue of Greenpeace. You know, we've had this whole issue of you know, of Greenpeace with all that destruction that they did over the many years with us. But yet in recent years, when there was a small community of Clyde River that was trying to protect its waters from these testing, you know, that was happening, the exploration testing that was happening, that was going to really impact. And I think it got all the way up to the Supreme Court in Canada. And Greenpeace said, can we help you? And the leaders there said, sure, it's time. Yes, you can help us. And although they got criticized for it, it was a way of, that's kind of the reconciliation that I talk about.
Absolutely.
You know, if there's a company that is still doing a lot of destructive work, then you say, no, I won't be part of that, or I won't accept funds from that. But if it is companies who are genuinely trying to shift the way in which they do things, and you feel that they're really trying to reinvent themselves in the ways that they should, then one has to think about these deeply. Because that's the other thing, is what I've often said now too, is, you know, a lot of these companies that are coming up to the Arctic now because of the melt and the resources that are showing themselves up, are the same companies that are doing awful stuff to people around the world in indigenous lands. So you have to ask the question, if these same companies are destroying and disrespecting people from other places in the world to indigenous world, are they actually reinventing themselves for us in the Arctic? Are they going to treat us any differently? You've got to do your homework and really check out who these people are before you say yes. That's what I'm saying, is that check it out first and make sure that they're the right partner. I'm all for partnerships, but make sure they're the right partner. Just you would in any situation, even at, you know, within your own personal life, check them out. Are they the right person to be your? Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you for that. We have gone on, and it's been so enjoyable. But I do want to give one more question in, and I think it's a good last question. It's from Belinda in the UK, and she writes, Sheila, you've achieved so much over the years to increase political representation of Inuit on the global stage. What are the current goals you are working towards? Next steps, I guess.
Well, yes, the next steps. Thank you for your question. Again, as I say, I'm still in self-isolation here, pretty much in my small community, and I haven't been anywhere since March. So, as I say, I've been through my own crisis, for two months. You know, just almost weeping. You know, wondering, okay, who am I without my talks? Who am I without connecting to people around the world on these teaching moments that I give? And so to try to redefine myself in that context has been a real challenge. But I'm hoping, because I saw this time of the pandemic as a place of deep introspection and changing of perspectives and seeing things differently. So I'm, you know, I feel like I'm in a place now where I'm starting to have more and more of these virtual events. And if you know of others that are willing to hear me virtually in talks, I can still have a livelihood, which I haven't had since March, really. And I'm living in the Arctic, where it's very high cost of living. So these things, you know, are a challenge, but in a sense, they have really been a gift. And I hope that they have been a gift for many others as well, is to see things differently, see the interconnections on why we are where we are. I've done some writing. So I think, did you say she was from the UK?
Yes, actually,
I'll do a little.
Please do. Yeah, I forgot that. Please mention that.
Yeah, so there's a piece that I wrote over the summer during what I call my pandemic writing, I guess, for the Granda magazine, and that will be out. It's from the UK, from London. Wonderful people I've been working with there, and that piece will be out November 19th. So be on the lookout for that. And again, it's more and more of these. And now I'm thinking that there may be a second book starting, where some foundations are going to try to support me for the next 9, 10, 12 months during this period of where I'm not able to travel, and do some more writing. And perhaps it could be the start of a second book on spirited leadership. That's kind of the approach that I'm taking that keeps coming up in terms of my awareness in my still thoughts and meditation. So, and on that note, if you have a chance, I would like to end with my piece on leadership, if that's how you'd like to end.
Yes, please.
Okay. Okay. Because I think we're pretty much done after this one, right? Is it?
Yes, yes,
Are we
we've
ending?
gone over, but please do end on your
Okay.
piece in the
Yes, 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 please. Yeah, and first, please, thank you. Thank you for everyone who's out there in the UK. And I've been very delighted, and I say delighted with a heartfelt way because very, very briefly, I want to honor someone who's not with us today. I had Terry Finch, who was a British man, who was my strategic counsel for 8 years with the global work that I did. And without his brilliance and his loyalty, I would not be where I am today. And he died very suddenly a few years ago. And I want to honor him. But when he would draft many of my speeches that I would add the heart and soul to, he would always start by saying, "I am delighted." And I would say, "Terry, I don't say I am delighted like a British person." And so we would laugh about it a lot. And so in his honor, in his spirit, and with my love, I dedicate this particular session today to Terry Finch, who was and he was wonderful. So I want to end, if I may. I was in Maine teaching a few years ago, the human dimension to climate change. I was asked by my own fellow Inuit women in Iqaluit, because I was living in Iqaluit for 20 years in Nunavut. And they said to me, could you, we're having an Inuit women's gathering, a workshop, a meeting, a conference, a summit that is dealing with all kinds of issues for women in the Arctic. We know you're away this year, but we really want your voice to be in the room. Can we do a video of you? Can you have somebody do a video of you while you're down there in Maine? And then they'll send it to us and we'll air it in our conference. But we want you to be part of this and we want your messaging to be with us. And they said, we have a specific question for you. And then if you could answer that, and amongst other things if you want to say in your video, but please, we have this question. And the question was, what does leadership mean to you? And so I thought a lot about it, and then I wrote it out, and then I was able to say it on a video. So I'd like to end with that today, from my awareness and from my space and place here in the Arctic, to all of you in the UK and Scotland and wherever you are in the world, for having me today. And I'm very, very touched by it all. So this is what leadership meant to me and means to me today. Leadership to me means to never lose sight of the fact that the issues at hand are much bigger than oneself. Leadership is about working from a principled and ethical place from within oneself. And it is to model authentically, genuinely for others, a sense of calm, a sense of clarity, and a sense of focus. And leadership is to always check inward, to ensure one is leading from a position of strength, not fear, not victimhood. So one does not project one owns limitations onto those you are modeling possibilities for. And so I end with that. And I go meet to you all.
Yeah.
Thank you
so much. It has just been such a pleasure. And I think as we are, we're all getting better at this digital connections, and you know, so we can carry on with, you know, pushing toward your interconnectivity, as you say. But thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. Thank you to everybody in the audience for your questions and listening. And please take a look again at Sheila's book. I ordered it here in the UK. And if you get a chance, please come to our exhibition in London. Thank you very much, and I wish you all a good evening.